Good afternoon, and thank you. My name is Chiara Della Mea. I work for the International Oil Pollution Compensation Fund. And before I start this presentation, I just wanted to thank UCAP Somalia, the UNEP, and of course the Ministry of Ports and Marine Transport for giving us the opportunity to talk about the International Civil Liability and Compensation Regime for Oil Pollution Damage, which is a bit of a mouthful, so apologies for that. Before I start to talk specifically about oil, I just wanted to spend a few words on the international regime for liability and compensation arising from marine pollution in general. Yesterday, you heard Jurke from the IMO talking about, briefly, mentioning the Bunkers Convention. That is part of a number of conventions which deal with marine pollution and liability. Obviously, first of all, the Civil Liability and the Fund Conventions, which deal specifically with liability arising of spills of persistent oil. Then the Bunkers Convention deals with liability arising out of pollution, contamination due to bunkers oil from all types of ships. Those four conventions are in force. There is also another convention about hazardous and noxious substances, which deals, as the name says, with discharge of hazardous and noxious substances, which is not in force yet, but we have quite a few ratifications coming in. There are other conventions that deal with liability in general. Obviously, the LLMC is the main one. But what these conventions do, and the reason why we're talking about it, is they create international uniformity in maritime law. So all damages caused by marine pollution are all treated in the same way, regardless of the substance. So how it all started? Well, it all started with the Torrey Canyon incident. That happened quite a while ago now, in 1967. It was a very large tanker which grounded just off the coast of the UK, of England, and the contamination of the cargo affected both England and France. It was the first incident where large-scale tankers were involved, so it received a lot of media coverage. And as I said, it created a lot of damages in two different countries. But what actually showed the public was that there was no international agreement on liability. That means that all the victims of the spill had to go to court to get compensation. And that was a very long process. It took years for the victims to receive compensation. So what the states, what the IMO, the members of the International Maritime Organization decided to do was to create a regime for compensation of victims of oil pollution. So this is what we're going to talk about today. The first liability convention for oil pollution damage was in 1969, so only 2 years after the incident. And the first fund convention was adopted 2 years later. But they've been changed over the years, and in the latest iteration is what we're going to talk about, because they are what is currently available for member states to accede to. And there, as I said, there are 3 conventions. The first is the Civil Liability Convention. The second is the Fund Convention, which establishes an international fund to provide compensation, and I work for the secretariat of this fund. And then there is another protocol which provide an additional layer of compensation, which I'm going to talk in more details about all of this specifically. But what I wanted to start with is what is the scope, the general scope of the conventions. They provide compensation to victims of pollution damage caused by spills of persistent oil from tankers. So the scope is limited only to persistent oil coming from tankers, from ships. They apply to any damage caused in the territorial waters, and exclusive economic zones of the member states. You can see here at the bottom right, it is a map of all the membership of the various conventions. As you can see, there are 145 parties to the Civil Liability Convention and 120 member states for the fund. So it's pretty well coverage, pretty wide coverage all across the world. The basic principles, like I said, they all came out of the Torrey Canyon, when the main need that was identified was to be able to provide quick compensation to victims without a prolonged court battles. So the idea is to provide compensation to victims of pollution damage through amicable settlement. The costs are shared between the ship owner and insurers and the oil receivers. The ship owner liability is covered by the Civil Liability Convention. The oil receiver liability is covered by the Fund Convention, and I will talk about it more in details later. But what they provide is consistent application of the compensation regime throughout the world. So all member states are applying the same convention, so they have the same rules on compensation, and all claimants are treated equally, which means that all claimants who have a valid claim will receive the same proportion of compensation. So obviously, if there is enough money to pay compensation, everybody will receive the amount of their established claim. If there is not enough money, everybody will receive the same proportion. Whether you're a government or a fisherman, hotel owner, anybody who received who suffered the damage will receive the same proportion of the compensation. Now, talking about pollution damage. The pollution damage is defined in the Civil Liability Convention is any loss of damage caused outside the ship by the contamination resulting from the escape of discharge of oil from the ship. And it also covers the cost of preventive measures. So any measures you take to reduce or minimize or avoid spill is also covered by the convention. Like I said, it works, there are 3 different conventions. It works in 3 tiers. So the first level of compensation is covered by the 92 Civil Liability Convention. The source of the compensation is the ship owner, which pays an insurance premium to an insurer, normally a P&I club, and it's the insurer that then pays the claimant. The second tier is covered by the Fund Convention. The source of compensation is the oil receivers in the fund states parties. Now, the oil receivers do not pay directly the claimants like in the first tier, but what they do is they pay a contribution based on the amount of oil they receive in a calendar year in their members in their facilities. They pay this contribution to the fund, and that it is the fund that pays the claimants. The supplementary fund protocol works the same way. So the source of compensation is the oil receivers in the members of the supplementary fund. They pay contribution to the supplementary fund, and the supplementary fund pays compensation. So the claimant is paid anyway, but it's paid in different ways. When we look at the Civil Liability Convention, the Civil Liability Convention is based on 3 main pillars. First of all is that the registered owner is strictly liable. So whether there is a damage, whether there is fault or not, the ship owner will pay. To give an example, we had a few years ago an incident in Korea, which was caused by a barge and a crane on top of a barge hitting a tanker that was at anchor. The tanker had no fault, it was just sitting there, but the crane hit the tanker, breached the side of the tanker, and oil was spilled. The owner of the tanker paid compensation to the victims. Now, to make sure, as I say, a sort of a balance to the fact that the owner is strictly liable, even if there is no fault, the owner is entitled to limit liability. And this limited liability is based on the gross tonnage of the ship. So the bigger the ship, the more the owner is liable to pay. To make sure that the owner is capable of paying, or if he's traveling, he is going to pay, they have to have compulsory insurance, third-party insurance, and they have to carry certificates on the ship. So whenever a tanker comes to your port, you know that the tanker is insured, and if in case of an incident, the owner will pay. And there are very few exceptions to liability. Now, before we go to the exceptions, just to give an idea of what I mean by limitation of liability, under the CLC, there is a sort of a sliding scale for liability. So there is a minimum liability of about $7 million US for all ships up to 5,000 gross tons. Then for each additional ton, the liability increases, and it goes up to 120 something million dollars. And up to that, it doesn't increase anymore. That's the maximum liability that you can have. So going back to the exceptions, as I said, there are very few. So the ship owner is really strictly liable unless it can prove that the damage has resulted from an act of war or a natural phenomenon like force majeure, a major storm, something unusual. If the damage was caused as a result of an intentional act by a third party, so sabotage, caused by sabotage, for instance, or if the damage was caused by negligence or a wrongful act of public authorities. So for instance, if the coastal state, the port state, was not maintaining signals or to get to the port, for instance. So if the damage was caused by poorly maintained navigational signals, here's an example. Now, on the other hand, the shipowner cannot limit liability if it is proved that the damage was caused by the owner's personal act or omission committed with intent. So with knowledge that the consequence of such act would be contamination. In this case, there is no limit and the shipowner is liable up to the maximum necessary to pay all the victims. Now, the second tier, as I said, is 92 fund, is based on the 92 Fund Convention. The fund will pay compensation for any damage that exceeds the shipowner's liability up to the limit of the fund. When the shipowner is financially incapable of meeting their obligation, or if the shipowner is exempt under the 92 Civil Liability Convention. Like I said earlier, the compensation is paid from the contribution from the receivers and the state parties. So it's not the states who pay, but it's the receivers. The maximum compensation available is about $287, $288 million, but that includes the CRC, Civil Liability Convention. So it is not on top of what the shipowner will pay, but it's included. So the maximum available for any incident up to it will be 203 million SDR, so 287 million US dollars. There are fewer exceptions than in the under the Civil Liability Convention. So the fund will be exempt for payment only if the damages resulted from an act of war, or if the claimant cannot prove that the damage resulted from a ship. So for instance, if you find oil on the beach, but you cannot identify where the oil comes from, if it's not from a tanker carrying oil as cargo, then you cannot receive compensation from the fund. The third tier is based on the supplementary fund protocol, is very similar to the second tier, but with a very big exception. We're going to talk about it. So pays compensation when the limit under the 92 fund is exceeded. The maximum compensation is over $1 billion US dollars. So it's much higher than the 92 fund. That again includes the amounts available under the Civil Liability Convention and the Fund Convention. The compensation is also paid based on contribution by the receivers or the state parties. However, because the amount is so high, if you don't have enough contributors in a member state, and I didn't say that before, but contributor is any importer of oil that imports more than 150,000 tons of oil per year. So if you don't have, the way the supplementary fund works is that when you sign the protocol, you basically declare that you accept that the minimum contribution you're going to give is based on 1 million tons, which means that if you don't have enough contributors in your country, will be the government of the state which will have to pay contribution based on this amount. Just to give you a pictorial explanation of what I'm talking about with the limits and the tiers, you can see the gray area is the limits under the Civil Liability Convention. It's a sliding scale up to 127 million US dollars, and then it plateaus. For anything above it, up to 286 million will be covered by the 92 fund. Again, as you can see from the table, it will include the civil liability amount. And for if you're a member of the supplementary fund, then you will have available over $1 billion US dollars, including the fund and the civil liability. Now, Somalia is not a member of, is not a party to any of these conventions, but I just wanted to give you an idea just to give you an idea of what would happen if there is an incident in the region. So you can see here, this is a map of the Western Indian Ocean area. So you can see the membership in the various conventions of all the states here. So you can see that Djibouti, Kenya, and Oman are parties to both the CRC and Fund Convention. Yemen and Saudi Arabia are only party to the Civil Liability Convention. And as I said, Somalia is not party. So to give an example, practical example of what would happen if there were an incident involving a tanker in a Bab al-Mandab Strait, you might have impact in Djibouti, Yemen, and Somalia. Now, if we go back to the map before, Yemen and Djibouti will share the compensation available under the Civil Liability Convention. If the damage is higher, Djibouti will have access to compensation up to 286 million US dollars. However, Somalia will not be able to use either of these conventions, so there will be no compensation on the based on the international regime for victims in Somalia. So that is why the conventions are important, because in practical terms, they give something. Now, all liability conventions have a time limit from when you can submit a claim. And for the Civil Liability Fund Convention, this time limit is 3 years from the date of the damage. And in any case, is 6 years from the date of the incident. If your claim is not settled within this period, you will have to start a legal action to make sure that you do not lose the right to receive compensation. Now, in general terms, the majority of claims, more than 90% of the claims in the history of the fund are settled within the 3 years. But if that does not happen, we will still inform the claimants. We will make sure that the claimants know that they have to protect their claim to receive compensation. Now, in terms of what is covered by the conventions, is pretty much any cost incurred or losses suffered after a spill. That could include cost of cleanup operations, cost of preventive measures taken to minimize the losses, any economic losses suffered because of the contamination by the fisher folk or mariculture operators, property damage if a fisherman boat goes out in the water and gets oil on the hull and it has to be cleaned, that is covered, any economic losses in the tourist sector, and any reasonable cost for reinstatement measures to reinstate the environment, monitoring activities, for as long as these claims are reasonable. For as long as what you're asking, you can prove it, and it makes sense, is something reasonable. So we do not accept future losses. It has to be losses incurred. And but I'm not going to go into many details because that is not the scope of this presentation. But just to give you a very quick idea of how it works, the criteria that we use for assessing claims are decided by the member states. We have developed a claims manual. You can see here the English version, but there is also an Arabic version that is available on the website if you want to take a look at it. So any decision is taken based on what the governments have told us to do. And the way it works, we will have the claimant submitting the claims either directly to the fund or to the local claims office. If the incident is big, we will open a local office. All the claims are approved by us. So all the assessments, we will assess the claim, we will decide, and the decision remains with the fund, or if it's a joint incident with the fund and the insurers. We take a decision on the assessment, we inform the claimant, and if the claimant is happy, we settle the claim. So in conclusion, and I know it's a very quick panoramic of how the funds work, but I'm very happy to answer any questions after this presentation. But just to give you an idea, the funds, the fund regime has been in place for over 40 years, and now it's 44 years. We have paid compensation for almost $1 billion now, 156 incidents, some from the 71 funds, some from 92 funds, but it works really well. And the fact that it works really well can be seen by the fact that all the other liability conventions that I mentioned in my first slide are all based on either the Civil Liability Convention or the Fund Convention. And as I said, it's very useful to have it because if you have an incident involving a tanker, then you have a source of compensation for the victims. That is all. So thank you very much for the attention. And if you have any questions, please let me know.